I'm Kendall Ross, and today we're going to read Knit Your Bit, a World War I story by Deborah Hopkinson and illustrated by Stephen Guarnacia. Now, students, when we look at the cover, what do you think the author's purpose was in writing this book? You can look a little bit closer. See, they're knitting an American flag, there's some children, got the knitting needles on the front. So we kind of know that this might be a story about knitting and patriotism just based off of the cover. So because we know that it might have something to do with knitting, let's knock out a few knitting specific vocab words before we get into the story, just so we don't get tripped up on those as we read. The first word is purl. Now, purling, it might seem complicated. It's just a specific word that people use when talking about knitting within this specific method that you knit into a stitch. So when you hear purling in the story, they're just talking about knitting. Just two needles together, string, pretty basic. The next word is muffler. This comes up quite a bit in the story, and it sounds like a car part, but it's actually just a word that was used in this time period within the book of World War I that has to do with a really long scarf that they made, as you'll see in the book, for soldiers. The third word is brigade. And this word sounds kind of complicated. It just has to do with the army groups that were split up within the time period, but it's used in a different way within the story. But when you hear brigade within the context of the book, just think of a specific subset of the army. So, now that we know a little bit of vocabulary, let's get into Knit Your Bit, a World War I story. When Pop left to be a soldier, I wanted to go with him. I'm brave, I told Pop. I know, Mikey, he said, patting my shoulder, and you'll need to be, 'cause it takes just as much courage to stay behind. Back home, Mama pulled out her knitting needles. Our soldiers will be cold come winter. Teach me, Ellie begged. I want to help. What about you, Mikey? Mama asked, fishing out more needles. No way. Boys don't knit, I said. Besides, I want to do something big to help. Okay, Mikey. Ellie finished her first hat a few days later. It wasn't much to look at, but she wrapped it up to send to Pop right away. You could knit him something too, Mikey. Like I said, sis, knitting is for girls. No, it's not, Ellie cried, grabbing the newspaper. Everyone is helping. Look at these firemen, and even President Wilson keeps sheep on the White House lawn for wool. Ellie turned the page. If we each do a little, it helps make something big, she said. I just rolled my eyes. A few days later, Miss Robin tacked a poster on the bulletin board. Wouldn't it be great if students from our class entered the knitting bee? Miss Robin asked. Mikey, you're always talking about how brave you are, Sarah said. This is your chance to help. But I bet you're scared you can't learn. Me? Scared? My friends and I can beat you any day. Mikey, sit down, Nick hissed. Dare you to enter, the girls cried all together. It's a deal, boys against girls. We'll call our team the Boys Knitting Brigade. I thought that sounded big and important enough. Let's stop here for a second. Mikey decides to call his team's group name the Boys Knitting Brigade. As we mentioned before, brigade is kind of the word that was used referring to these groups within the army. Do you think that him naming his group brigade has something to do with the fact that he sees knitting as something kind of feminine? That's kind of what I think, especially as they build this kind of competition between him and the girls, that he sees like calling it a brigade and making it more of like a military thing as a way to kind of combat the idea that he sees it as just a girly thing to do by making it very brave, very military. You can kind of see that. Fine, said Josie. We'll be the Pearl Girls. Pearl Girls? I didn't even know what pearl meant. I gulped. What have I gotten into? See, Mikey doesn't know what pearl means either, but he's about to learn, because he's about to learn how to knit. Good job, Mikey. Mama offered to give us lessons. Nick and Dan came over every day after school to practice. After we'd figured out how to hold our needles and knit, which was hard enough, Mama even showed us how to purl. See, so his mom is teaching him all these knitting methods, how to purl, how to knit. See all the boys together. Nick was the major of mufflers. Again, he's just knitting scarves. I just want to make it seem fancy. You can see him down here, knitting the little scarves. I was the sergeant of socks, which are not easy, believe me, especially the heels. As for Dan, well, mostly his yarn just got tangled. Our cat loved it. Let's pause here again. We talked a little bit earlier about how Mikey called his group the Knitting Brigade, very masculine, very military. You can see here that now Mikey's kind of giving them like very militaristic names for what they're knitting. You know, the Major of Mufflers, the Sergeant of Socks. So when I see that, I kind of see Mikey, as he learns how to knit, still kind of holding on to this idea of helping in that way, because that's kind of what he views as helping, is you help in this big way, you're a sergeant, even though he is knitting and helping in that way. So I think that's really interesting. Finally, the day of the knitting bee arrived. Central Park was a sea of women and men, old and young, and lots of girls. Forward march, I commanded. Mikey, we're the only boys, whispered Nick. I sure hope we don't get laughed out of here. Look at that food! When do we eat? Dan asked. Those sausages smell delicious. Over here, boys, called Miss Robin. Naturally, the Pearl girls were ready to go. Sarah smiled sweetly, but she was all business. Get ready to be beaten by the fastest knitters in New York City. I led my troops to a nearby bench. See, he's still using that kind of language, the troops and the military and the soldiers. Ignore those girls, soldiers. Speed isn't everything. There are prizes for the best knitting, too. We unraveled our yarn and grabbed our needles. The band struck up a rousing march. Drummers beat tin buckets with knitting needles, of course. Rat-tat-tat, rat-tat-tat. Cast on. My men performed with courage, mostly. Dan came close to deserting us for the food tables, and Nick got distracted watching Mrs. Rizzo's flying fingers. She won a prize for knitting a sweater. 5 hours and 45 minutes exactly. We knit all afternoon and the next day too. By the third day, the pressure was on. Dan's piece looked more like an old dish rag than a hat. Nick was still clicking away, though the edges of his muffler were all zigzaggy because he kept adding stitches or dropping them. I finished one sock yesterday. Now I was on my second. I was feeling pretty good. The first sock was definitely my best yet. Maybe I'd even win a prize for the pair if I could get the second one done by the end of the day. Seems like Mike is feeling pretty good about things, you know? In the beginning of the book, he was kind of worried, he didn't want to learn, and now that he's really good at it, he really seems to like it. Do you think that he's gonna stay with it, keep knitting, win the competition? I can definitely see either way happening. Ellie offered to bring me some lunch, but I just shook my head. Oh, you're doing so good, Mikey. Let me see. Ellie gave a little gasp. Oh no, Mikey. Look, she whispered. A hole. You dropped a stitch right at the beginning there. Somehow I'd missed it, but Ellie was right. To make it perfect, I'd have to rip the whole sock apart and start over again. I hung my head. Knitting was stupid. So you can see here that kind of when Mikey starts to not be doing as well at knitting, he kind of turns away from it. So, how do you think he's going to go forward now, feeling less confident in what he's doing? For me, what I think, just based on, his expression and how he's feeling, is he's feeling very defeated, so he might try to give up. Maybe someone will come in and help him, try to figure out how to fix his stitch. That's kind of what I think, especially because he's learned so much throughout the book from other people. You can make your own predictions about what Mikey will do in his knitting journey. I felt like breaking my needles and stomping on everything. Nice work, kid. I glanced up. A young soldier stood before me. He nodded toward my one perfect sock on the bench. Thank you, sir, I stammered, but I was still feeling miserable. But I'm really not so good at this. Well, you're trying, aren't you? That's what counts. We were silent a minute. You got someone over there? Yes, sir, my dad, I told him. All at once I missed Pop so much, my eyes stung. I wondered where he was. I could almost see him hiding in a muddy ditch or shivering in the rain. How could anything I do, little or big, really help? Warm wool socks would have felt mighty cozy last winter, the soldier said. So you keep on knitting, kid. I bet your dad will be real glad to wear those socks. Yes, sir. I wasn't sure what to do next, so I stood and saluted, and then I took the sock apart and began again. That's kind of fun. He interacted with a soldier who'd been there, and he's decided to keep going and start over on the sock. Sarah had finished a muffler, Molly had made a pair of socks, and Josie's hat was perfect. Good job, Pearl girls. Now let's see how you did, said Sarah. For a minute, we stood in silence. Finally, Dan said, I guess my yarn got a little greasy from the sausages. We all laughed. I held out my hand to Sarah. You beat us fair and square. No hard feelings, Mikey? No, just wait till next time. I never did finish that pair of Central Park knitting bee socks. Instead, before we left, I got up my courage and found the young soldier. This is for you. I held out my best ever perfect sock. Gee, thanks, kid, he said, and don't give up. I won't, I promised. As for what happened next, well, Nick and Dan never went near knitting needles again. But all by herself, Ellie made hats for every soldier in Pop's unit. They sent her a picture of themselves. That's so cute. As for me, I did keep trying, and though it took a while, I finally knit a pair of socks for Pop. He wrote back to say that they were his favorites. He promised to wear them on the day he came home. And he did. I love this. So you can kind of see, maybe, how he was able to make a difference in someone's life in a little way through knitting. You can kind of tell by the way he was able to knit for his father. Ellie was able to knit for all these soldiers. So they were able to make a difference in this kind of way that seemed so small. And what's interesting is that this was based on a real story from World War I. There's tons of propaganda to get people to knit. Tons of women did this, and obviously some men knit for soldiers. It was a huge, huge thing. So now that you know this, I want you to go and write a raft, which is a writing exercise where you take on the persona of another person. And I want you to take on the persona of a soldier who received one of these knit goods, kind of like Mikey and Ellie's dad. And I want you to write a one-page thank you letter outlining what it meant to you to have this small act of kindness in your life, how that impacted you as a serviceman or woman, having those kinds of things given to you, how you appreciated these small acts, one page from the point of view of a soldier who received these knit goods, and outline maybe who sent it to you, whether it was a child or a woman or a family member, and thank them specifically for what they did and kind of what that meant for you. So that was Knit Your Bit, a World War I story. Thank you.